So I finished 8 books in November. As always, I will group the reviews by genre, put chapters below, and save my book of the month for last. Let's start with The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane. So this was written in the 1890s and is set in the American Civil War. We follow a young man, really not much more than a boy, who sees kind of the illusions of what the war would be like. He thinks that it could be a chance for him to show glory and to show his bravery, so he enlists in the Union Army. And what the story is about is really seeing that romanticization of what the war is about, running into what the reality of the war is about. And I thought it was very well written. It wasn't written, so I sometimes struggle with late 19th century, early 20th century prose. It seems like a lot of writers wrote in a very, very dry and dense kind of writing style, but I think the writing style here is very, very universal. The themes certainly are very universal. I feel like I've read this. This felt very familiar to me, so I don't know if maybe I read this in junior high or high school or something like that, but it felt very familiar to me as we see this boy struggling with dealing with wanting to get this red badge of courage, this wound, to outwardly show how brave he is, while at the same time being afraid that he's going to run when they get to their first battle. And that's kind of where the story unfolds. And I thought it was a really great book. It's really short. I mean, this is a very, very short book. And while I had hoped for maybe a bit more of a cathartic ending, I can still just very easily recommend The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane. All right, I listened to the audiobook of Kenobi by John Jackson Miller. Now, this has the same title as the Disney Plus show and has a lot of similarities to the Disney Plus show. The book came first, and frankly is a better story. It's not quite as big of a story or with the big ramifications of the story as the show, but it's executed a lot better than that television show was, unfortunately. But as for the book's great. It's set on Tatooine. It's set after episode 3 of the movies, and you see Kenobi just in his kind of his new role in a very new universe. And he's trying to deal with that. One of the things Miller does really well in this book is he just establishes the setting of Tatooine extremely well. Just the world-building elements are fantastic. You learn about the moisture farmers, and you get to kind of see the different settlements. You learn about the Sand People in a manner done so much better than the Book of Boba Fett. I don't mean this to be a rant against Disney Star Wars, although it's more miss than hit. Anyway, you get to learn about the Sand People, and you get to see a little bit of the criminal underground in Tatooine. But for me, what made this book great was kind of the subtext, and not even a huge plot point, is just Kenobi himself dealing with the aftermath of the effects of Episode 3. Although it's in there, it's not a prominent part of the story, but it's firmly in the subtext, and I thought Miller showed a lot of restraint, just kind of giving you enough of it to make you realize that what had happened to him and what had happened to the universe is really weighing on this character. It was so well done. And I felt that you could see that in the plotting as well, because you see Kenobi makes mistakes in this book. He makes mistakes both in action and in judgment of some people, and that really plays into the fact that he's kind of struggling and not balanced with what has happened in the universe. But it's a really great book. I've read probably, I'll have to go count, I've probably read 20, 25 Star Wars books, so I'm not a huge expert as far as the Star Wars novels are, but I've read enough to say that this is one of the better ones. It's probably a top 5 Star Wars novel for me. I thought it was just incredibly well done beginning to end. And if you haven't listened to any of these Star Wars novels on audio, I highly recommend them. Jonathan Davis was the narrator, and he is fantastic. But beyond that, you get kind of special effects, you get sound effects, you get occasional soundtracks, you get some John Williams music in there as well. So it's a really just high-level production for just one Audible credit, or get it from your library, where I listened to a lot of mine before this one. But I really enjoyed Kenobi by John Jackson Miller. Another book I really enjoyed was Wistful Ascending by J.C.M. Berne. So the author sent this to me like 10 months ago. We were on a live stream together, and he said, "Hey, can I send you my book? No strings attached. Don't need to read it or review it or anything." And I said, "Sure." But I wanted to read it because my friend Brian over at BellTube has been raving about the Hybrid Helix series and this is the first book of that series. So I'd been wanting to read it, and I finally was able to fit it in November, and I was so glad because I enjoyed this from page 1 all the way to the end. This is a kind of sci-fi thriller in the space opera vein with a big, vast universe, a very compelling central protagonist, and a story that just never sagged and kept going. But it was also not like extremely breakneck pace that you weren't able to get a lot of feel for the world and the world building elements, which a book one, frankly, has to do quite a bit when you're doing a book series. One of the reasons I was originally hesitant to read this, to be honest, though, is I had heard this as kind of superhero fiction. And there are aspects of that. Like many people, I was kind of burned out from superheroes from MCU. I don't think I've seen a single thing after Endgame, and haven't had any desire to see anything after that. But I read this and I was glad that it wasn't really at all like a superhero. You do have a character that has a lot of abilities. His name's Rohan, but it's a very different kind of story because you find him, he's living on a space station, a very interesting space station that's sentient, by the way, but he's living on this space station that he has a menial job and not a really important job. He doesn't even want to be promoted. He just wants to kind of retire from the things in his past that he wants to stay away from at this point. But events conspire that he has to get involved. And what I really liked is that you see him as a reluctant hero, but not an overly reluctant hero. I loathe overly reluctant heroes. I know that's kind of one of my things with reading. I can't stand the overly reluctant ones. You can tell that he doesn't want to do things that showcase the powers that he has, but he also realizes he needs to help any way he can. And there's also no hyperbolic, with great power comes great responsibility, BS like that. It's just very subtly and very well done. I thought the character right away just came alive for me. I liked seeing that he has a lot of depth, a lot of layers. There's some darkness in his past. Even though he's a superhero, you see that he's human, well, kind of, and there's fallibility in him, there's insecurity in him, and I really enjoyed getting to know this character. One thing I really enjoyed, so there are some exposition dumps in here, which you have to do in book one of any series, but I really like the way that Berne handled them. He handled a lot of them with characters having meals together and conversing in that way, which on paper doesn't seem like it would be as effective as it is, but it was for me because I think one world-building aspect that I love when authors lean into is actually the food, the kinds of things that the people eat and the beverages that they drink. I think it informs a lot about a culture when you're in a fantasy or science fiction story, the foods and the drinks that they consume. So I really liked that part of it, and I think in many ways that helped me just enjoy kind of the sections that were exposition dumps, whether it was about the world or about the characters that I'm sure that we'll be seeing throughout this series. But I mean, top to bottom, this was a fantastic read. I really enjoyed Wistful Ascending, the first book of the Hybrid Helix series, and there's 0% chance I won't be continuing the series in 2026. Up next is Knight of Knives by Ian C. Esslemont. This is the first book in the novels of the Malazan Empire. Yeah, that's what it's called. So if you weren't aware, Steven Erikson and Ian C. Esslemont created the Malazan world together. And it seems like Erikson has all the press. He got the early book series, the book deal. And he has the big 10-book series, which is kind of the center point of this Malazan universe. But Esslemont eventually started publishing these books, and I think there are 6 of these novels of the Malazan Empire that I think fill in the gaps for some of the things in the 10 main books. They introduce some characters that you see later in the books. They, from what I understand, continue some stories of some characters that might be in the 10 books that kind of don't follow all the way through the trajectory of that series. So a lot of ways it just kind of fleshes out the world a bit more. And I really enjoyed this first installment. I've come to love the Malazan world. I mean, the world building is so intricate and it's so vast, and there's so much to learn about it. And I love discovering different things about it every time I read a Malazan book. And the other thing I really loved about this was, look at this. I'm going to hold up another Malazan book later in this video, and it's like 5 times the width of this. It was so refreshing to read something in the Malazan world that was short and frankly didn't demand as much of me as a reader. as much as I love the Malazan Book of the Fallen, it takes a lot of mental focus, and it demands more of its reader than a lot of other books. And this one wasn't quite as demanding. You only had 2 or 3 POVs, 2 really main characters. It takes place in a single night, a very important night, and it's set actually before the entire series of Malazan Book of the Fallen. I was told to read this between the 5th and 6th books because it does inform some setting into the 6th book, and there are some characters that appear in the 6th book that I totally missed, but I love comment sections because the comment section of my Bonehunters video, I was able to find out those. But I really enjoyed my time with this one. I don't think it reaches the highs at all of any of the Erikson books I've read so far, but again, it was just refreshing to read a shorter Malazan book and just to be in this world for a few days rather than a few weeks. Up next is The Return of the Shadow by J.R.R. Tolkien and Christopher Tolkien. That is the 6th volume of the History of Middle-earth, which Christopher Tolkien the son compiled after the death of the father, J.R.R. Tolkien. There are 12 volumes of the History of Middle-earth, and this was volume 6. And of the 6 that I've read so far, this is by far my favorite of them all. In fact, if I were to recommend extended Tolkien reading for people, this one would come into that list. The other 5 probably not, but this one would come into this list. So what I loved about this is, so the History of Middle-earth starts with the First Age. We're finally up to the Third Age where Lord of the Rings takes place. And this is not necessarily history, but this is all of the rough drafts of J.R.R. Tolkien in starting the Lord of the Rings. And I found it fascinating. You get to see, first of all, you know I love craft. Anytime I talk to an author on the channel, one of the things that always comes up, and I always ask them about, is their craft, what's their process, those kinds of things. I love learning about any artist's craft. So seeing Tolkien's craft in this book was just fantastic. I really loved it. But there's 2 things that really stood out, because this entire book basically shows you kind of 3 big or 8 small drafts of the story of the Lord of the Rings, starting from Bag End and getting to Rivendell. And the 2 things that really stood out for me, the first thing is that how clear the story was in Tolkien's mind, because all these different iterations of these different drafts, the story was basically the same. You know, we get to Bree, we have the things with the farmer, we have Tom Bombadil, we get to Rivendell, you know, the Fellowship and all of that. So much of that was firmly in Tolkien's mind, but what wasn't in his mind was the characters in the story. And I found that part of it just fascinating. First of all, Frodo's name was not Frodo. Get this. Frodo's name for the first 5 drafts was Bingo Bolger Baggins. I dare say the Lord of the Rings wouldn't have been as successful if the character's name was Bingo. Anyway, but you saw even beyond that, even just the names of the characters changing, the circumstances of the birthday party at the beginning changing, the number of hobbits that leave Bag End was different, very different times. 3 sometimes, 5 sometimes, 4 sometimes. The Strider character wasn't always who the character is now. I mean, I just found it fascinating how he just kept refining until he locked into the story that he was going to tell. So I would say, you know, if you're going to read Tolkien, obviously Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are the 2 you have to read. If you want to go beyond that, Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales should be your next 2. Then I would say the 3 Great Tales. And then if you want to go to a little bit more, but maybe not the whole 12 volumes, pick up the 6th volume, Return of the Shadow. It's my favorite of the 6 volumes of the History of Middle-earth that I've read thus far. I read Side Jobs by Jim Butcher last month. It is a short story collection set in the world of the Dresden Files. It's mostly short stories, like 7 or 8, I think, and then a novella at the end. And I enjoyed it. It's not integral. I think if I ever do a series reread of Dresden, I won't read these again. Most of them are kind of throwaway stories, but what I really enjoyed about it was actually learning about kind of the genesis of the story, but also seeing where it's placed. And these stories go from being something from before the first book, The Dresden Files, all the way up to the end. The last one is a novella, which is set after changes. And that's probably the crown jewel of this collection. And the only one that I would consider kind of like a 5-star story in there was one called Aftermath. And it follows a different character. It doesn't follow Harry, but it follows somebody else basically an hour after the events of Changes. And that novella was fantastic. The rest of the stories were fine. There was one narrated by Thomas, which I enjoyed. Some of the other ones were enjoyable. Like there was one at Billy's wedding. I like that story. But overall, they're fine. No regret reading them, but probably not a collection that I'll have to revisit again when I reread the series at some point. All right, the last one in the fantasy genre is The Bonehunters by Steven Erikson. This literally came in the mail an hour ago. I read it on my trade paperback, so I didn't get to read it in this gorgeous broken binding edition. But I really love this book, and there's a couple things that I will reflect upon this book most. First of all, if you want spoilers, I did a spoiler vlog already. If you want to check that out, I forget which corner it ends up in, but I'll put a little link up here. I did a vlog when I read this, and that's total spoilers. Of course, these reviews are non-spoiler. But one of the things that I loved about Bonehunters is this was the first time I told myself I love this series. I've liked this series a lot. I've enjoyed the installments. I've enjoyed it. But this is the first time, about halfway through this book, I was reading it, and I just said, I love this. So I'm glad that I'm at that point with Malazan, because it's been kind of a long journey for me. You know, I don't read these very often. I spread them out. I stopped for about 18 months in the middle. Anyway, but I really enjoyed Bonehunters. The other thing I really enjoyed about this book is it's kind of the first time where we see all the storylines kind of converging. The first and third books are set on one continent. The second and fourth books are set on a second continent. And the fifth book's set on a third continent. Well, finally, we get to see all three of these major story arcs kind of coming together on the same continent that the second and fourth books were. So you can start seeing a little bit more of the bigger picture. Again, also, as the series goes on, Erikson starts to reveal more to you. And while I still don't understand the big picture a whole lot, I understand more, and I can start to see how like the gods are getting involved and how it's influencing the things on the world, and I'm really enjoying that aspect of it. But what was interesting to me is I'm in the middle of book 6, and these stories are starting to intertwine. And there were characters and stories that basically started in book 1 that really hadn't gotten to a really interesting part until now. And I wanted to go back and reread. So I can already see why the big fans of this series often reread this series, because the more you know, the more you want to go back and see the things that maybe you had missed and maybe understand things a little bit better as you go along. So I still have 4 books to finish the series before I really contemplate a reread, but I really enjoy it. There's a famous chapter in here that I won't name, just in case anybody doesn't want spoiled what chapter it is. It's a real long chapter that lived up to the hype. It was just absolutely incredible in so many ways. It had one of the most meaningful character arcs I've read in months, in a single chapter of a character who's not even the focus of the chapter, but is a part of the chapter. It just really showed that Erikson is just an extremely gifted writer, and seeing how all of these things, these plot things are intertwining, it really was such an enjoyable thing. If it hadn't run up into the Juggernaut, that is my next book, it would have been an easy book of the month for me. But nevertheless, I love The Bonehunters by Steven Erikson, and I look forward to continuing the Malazan Book of the Fallen sometime in 2026. My book of the month is Mockingbird by Walter Tevis. I was on a live, actually on the channel, it was Brunch and Books that I hosted a couple months ago with Jimmy and Joanna, and they both recommended this book, and I listened to them because they have good tastes, and they usually steer me the right direction if they give me personal recommendations, and they were right on this because this was incredible. Now, I'm going to be vague because one of the great joys for me in reading this book was the actual discovery of the elements of this book. So I'll be as specific as I can without ruining that for you, because I really want you to go read Mockingbird by Walter Tevis. So this is set 400 or 500 years in the future, and it's quasi-post-apocalyptic, and it's a story with very few characters, and the characters are quite isolated. We have a man, we have a woman, we have an advanced robot. And one of the joys of this book is finding out, first of all, seeing how foreign this existence is, and then finding out how they got there, and then reflecting upon it. it's very interesting. There's a big aspect of this society in this story that in 2025 you can see, oh, I could see it going that way. How Tevis saw this in 1980, I have no idea. A lot of times when you read these post-apocalyptic stories and you see something that's very different, you can kind of connect the dots from like A to B. And it's real easy. Oh, yeah, so that makes sense. This book, A and B were so far apart, it was so interesting to me to figure out how it got there. Because it was such a foreign landscape, even though it was set in America in whatever year this is. So that part of the discovery process was amazing. But there's also just a discovery process going on with the characters that I really enjoyed. Because in this far future story, in many ways, people have forgotten what it means to be a human. And the man, the woman, and even the robot, in many ways, are trying to discover what humanity is and what it means to be human. And that process was fantastic. So this was a rare book that I listened to and read. I didn't do the immersion reading. I really don't have any desire to do that. But I started it on an audiobook and I was so enthralled. I went to my Libby app and I got it for free. So I was able to read and I read a little bit. And then the next day when I take a walk, I put the audiobook on. So I did a little bit of both. So I can recommend the audiobook or the reading experience both for this. But Mockingbird by Walter Tevis is a thought-provoking work. It's a typical sci-fi work with great ideas, and it's not very thick. It's not a very long book, but I definitely highly recommend it, obviously, because it is my book of the month for November 2025. So hey, that was my November. I'd love to hear about yours. Let me know what your favorite book was last month. And if you've read any of these, let's talk about them in the comments section below. Just please label any spoilers so that nobody gets spoiled with anything about these books. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Goodreads, and the Fireside Discord. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Till next time, goodbye.